Chris Fitzgerald, and thanks as always for joining me for the Jazz-Based Technique series. This video is a different animal from other videos in the series because it's a recreation of a presentation given several weeks ago at the 2019 International Society of Bassists Convention in Bloomington, Indiana. The subject of the presentation is adapting the music of J.S. Bach as technical etudes for aspiring pizzicato bassists. A working subtitle for this episode might be Pizzicato Articulation from Bach to Bebop. While most of this presentation will be shown in a split screen format with topics on the left and discussion and demonstration of those topics on the right, I'd like to take a few moments to talk about how this whole project got started. The reasons I began playing cello suite movements pizzicato on the lower register of the bass are many, and some of these reasons will be discussed as well later in the presentation. But in short, I was in search of a lyrical jazz voice as a jazz player, and working through the suite movements seemed to bring out the lyricism of the music in a very natural and organic way. The technical challenges of the music were very helpful, but also the sound, the lyrical sound of all the great cellists who had recorded them that was just ringing in my head the whole time, led me to pursue the idea that I could get the same sonic results playing pizzicato in the low registers as the cellists did playing with the bow in the higher registers. And I quickly discovered that this sound easily transferred over from my Bach etude playing to my actual jazz playing without me thinking about it too much. The transfer was also natural because, as we'll see later, the musical language of J.S. Bach and the musical language of jazz in bebop are actually way more alike than they are different. The genesis of this realization about the similarity of styles between the two types of music came over 30 years ago when the three foundational elements of my musical life converged in a single place in time. In the late 1980s, I was a graduate student majoring in theory and composition. Piano was my principal instrument, and jazz was a four-letter word as far as the faculty and administration of the school were concerned. Those of us who practiced it pretty much in secret, but we were not going to be deterred, so we did practice it. The three elements that came together were the music of J.S. Bach, the language of bebop jazz, and an inspirational teacher who would later go on to become the greatest musical mentor of my life. The first two elements came together as I was working on a project for an advanced counterpoint class. My assignment was to analyze every prelude and every fugue in both books of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, and then to write an analytical summary of tendencies of melody, harmony, and form. At the same time, I was studying transcribed solos of Charlie Parker and transcriptions I had done of the great jazz pianist Kenny Barron. Being exposed to these two seemingly contradictory styles of music and listening to these recordings pretty much non-stop and back-to-back led me to the intuitive conclusion that the melodic and harmonic language were not only very much alike, but almost impossibly identical. As we'll see later in the presentation, this intuitive observation turned out to be more accurate than I could ever have imagined. The third element that joined the other two and helped bond them together forever in my mind was the brilliant teaching of Doris Keyes, who was my classical piano teacher and general font of musical wisdom, who became a giant Yoda figure in my life. She opened my eyes to a lot of musical truths, and I'll be sharing a few of those throughout this presentation. But the concept that brought Bach and jazz together for me can be summarized by the following idea, which I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember her exact words. But basically, she said that everything you ever play in your life is a melody, if you will only be open to hear and see it that way. And every melody deserves to be given the performer's full respect and attention in every moment that it's sounding. The difference, she said, between a mediocre player and a great player is that a mediocre player types out the notes and rhythms accurately on their instrument, while a great player understands the story that a melody is telling and lovingly crafts it as a plot with movement, momentum, and connected meaning so that each phrase builds upon the meaning of the last until the entire story is told. Imagine being in your early 20s and having a much older and more experienced person lay this on you and the effect that it would have, and you'll be pretty much right where I was at that time. To me, this realization meant that to strive to become a great player means to recognize and respect melody in all music regardless of style. while the import of her statement is very clear as regards the performance of classical music, for the performance of jazz, for me, it also meant that every melody, every bass line, every string of harmonic voicing should be crafted in the same way with the bigger picture of the whole in mind. And what better way to transfer the lesson from its classical origins to its eventual target in the jazz language than to treat melody and jazz with the same degree of care and respect as we would if we were playing Bach. That is basically the origin of this project. And at this point, we'll begin the presentation proper in split screen format and delve into some of the details of the project. Okay, now that we're here in split screen mode, we can begin the presentation proper. What you're going to see is a keynote presentation on the left, which will introduce topics. I'll be here on the right talking about the topics and demonstrating any examples that need to be played for the presentation. If you see me looking over to the right, I'm actually running the keynote presentation from here. If you see me looking over to the left, I'm actually looking at the screen. So don't worry about any of that. It's sort of a complicated one-man show here, so I'll do the best I can. So what the Bachrilege project is a series of editions of cello suite movements arranged for pizzicato bass. And I've been playing the pizzicato versions of cello suite movements for about 10 years. At this point, I've completed the first suite, the first cello suite. Two of these editions, the edition for the prelude and the jig movements, are complete and available for free on my website. The recordings of the entire suite, all 6 movements, are available on my website and on my YouTube channel. So I'll begin by talking a little bit about what these editions entail and why I think it's important that they be constructed this way. So the editions of the cello suite movements for technical study include 3 separate parts. The first is a naked score showing only the notes and rhythms of the arrangement, including any alterations or transposed notes. Some, because of the range of the instrument, because of the range of the cello as compared to the range of the bass, when we play them down an octave, some notes have to be transposed and some passages have to be transposed in order to make them work. So the naked score is just the notes and rhythms, but it also includes anything that has been changed from the original. The second version is a score that's annotated with suggested articulations to facilitate pizzicato performance, and we'll be getting into what all of these are later in the presentation. And the third version is a complete score with suggested articulations and fingerings. And a student may or may not want to use all of this information. Everybody plays things a little bit different, but the point of that is to show how it was done on the recording and what fingerings and articulations were used, should the student want to do it exactly the same as it was done on the recording. I actually encourage students to use the naked score and to develop their own edition of the piece so that they can personalize it to their own tastes. Here's a copy of the simple naked score of the jig, and you can see a few notes have been moved up the octave to make them fit in the range, and I think there may be a triple stop which is turned into a double stop. The jig was one of the movements that was easiest to adapt to pizzicato performance because it almost already fit the way that it was in Bach's original manuscript version. Here's a copy of the score with suggested articulations. And these articulations include things that we're going to be looking at later in this presentation in greater detail. Things like hammer-ons, pull-offs, rakes, and later articulated legato. And these editions are also available on the website, so if you want to see them up closer and not so small on the screen, you can just download them from my website. And then finally, the version with every articulation and every fingering included in it. I really like the line that Kieran Hanlon had, that I believe he had borrowed from somebody else. He said that fingerings are like toothbrushes. You probably don't want to use somebody else's. I think that's a great line. I'm not sure who was responsible for the original line, but it's beautiful. But again, in case anybody wanted to know what fingerings did you use for your performance, if you feel like those work, they might be an option for you. Otherwise, it's probably best for each player to come up with their own fingerings for the edition. At this point, I just want to get a sound in the ear of the person watching and listening to this video of what I was seeing and hearing at the time I was practicing either the Bach cello suites at slow tempo or jazz melodies at slow tempo. It seemed as though, for reasons I explained earlier in this video, the two sounds seemed to mesh so completely that whenever I was playing one, it was very easy to hear the other, and vice versa. So this is what I've written on the screen is a heavy-handed sacrilegious mashup by the fictitious composer Johann DeByrd, and it is his almost until now unknown Opus 2. Enjoy. Okay, so all silly mashups by fictional composers aside, what are the elements of these two musics, the similarities between the styles that would be of interest to jazz bassists? Both represent a melodic style that outlines harmony rather than simply playing it against a harmonic accompaniment. This is important because this is the language of jazz, not only of heads and melodies, but also of soloing, so it's sort of getting that sound in your ear. Both are extremely technically challenging to play or perform on the bass. Duh, we know that by doing it. Both were created by first-tier composers in their respective genres and then adapted to the bass. This is pretty important because as bass players, we know that we have been largely overlooked by the greatest composers in our styles. If you're a classical bassist, you're often playing transcriptions and adaptations by great composers that were originally written for other instruments. And if you're a jazz player, very little has been written for the jazz bass. You're playing things that were originally written for trumpets and saxophones and singers. And so by playing this music in this way, we're playing some of the greatest music that is out there, even though it wasn't written for us. Because this music was not conceived for the bass, it offers bassists a huge opportunity to expand the palette of articulation for our instrument. And this is a really big point and an important one, I think, because if we only listen to bass players, we're only going to sound like bass players. If we listen to cellists, we're going to expand what we can do. If we listen to saxophone players and trumpet players and singers, we're going to expand what our concept of articulation would be, because we're going to be going for something that was not conceived of our instrument. This makes me think of a story told by a friend of mine who took lessons with the great bassist Michael Moore. And he relayed to me that the greatest backhanded insult or backhanded compliment, however you want to look at it, in a lesson that Michael would give to him was he would play something and Michael Moore would say, "Okay, you're soloing like a bass player." And to him that was like the worst thing that he could say, because he wanted the student to solo more like a horn player, more like a lyrical melodic instrument. So this gives us a chance to try to go for things that we wouldn't naturally think of because they originated on another instrument. And of course, when played out of tune, both sound particularly atrocious, spurring the bassist to either practice like crazy to improve or just quit. We hope we'll go for the latter. But it's very important, especially when playing Bach. It's a funny thing that happens. I hear students play jazz out of tune all the time, and they often just let it go. When they're playing Bach, they play one note out of tune, and immediately they notice and they realize they have to fix it. It's almost like when you play a note out of tune in a Bach cello suite, you've just drawn a mustache on the Mona Lisa. And I think that's a pretty universal feeling. So it's good that we practice this music because it makes us really strive for a greater level of accuracy, if not perfection. Why should or would a jazz student practice cello suite movements? Well, the first one is obvious. Practicing great music is incredibly motivational. Again, the melodic and harmonic language, harmonic outlining mixture of scalar and arpeggiated melodic construction is very similar to the jazz language, and in the very end of this presentation we're going to examine that in a little bit more depth. And another obvious one, technically challenging music improves technique. If we only practice things that are easy, it's not helping us that much. If we practice things that are very difficult, as many of the cello suites are, we become better. Here's the crux of everything. Why would or should a jazz player practice suite movements pizzicato instead of with a bow? And why play them in the lower register of the bass rather than up the octave at the same pitch that a cello would? I want to start by saying there is absolutely no reason not to practice the suites or any music with the bow. However, jazz players, along with other pizzicato players in various other styles, spend 95% of their time performing pizzicato. The right hand's role in pizzicato articulation is best practice pizzicato. Now, I've heard people argue this point, but I think it's pretty clear that if you want to get good at baseball, you practice baseball, not cricket. So, you practice the thing that you're going to be spending most of your time doing if you want to get better at it. Most pizzicato bassists spend the majority of their time accompanying other musicians in the lower registers of the bass. And this speaks to why play them in the bottom registers of the bass rather than up high. We know that the standard performance practice for classical bassists, as far as the suites go, is to play most of them up in thumb position so that they sound where they sounded when a cello plays them. For jazz bassists, pizzicato bassists, there's two reasons not to do that. One is that without the bow, the instrument doesn't speak very lyrically up in this register. But more importantly, we spend most of our time playing down here, and it makes sense to practice our technique down here where most of our music occurs. And last, and this is very much related to the last point, but I still think very important, learning to better articulate in the lower registers is difficult, but it will improve the collective experience of every ensemble that the bassist participates in. This is super important because if the bassist doesn't have a lyrical voice or doesn't have a handle on articulation, the bottom end of every ensemble is going to be a lot rougher than it needs to be. A bassist who has the capability to play lyrically in the bottom range is going to make the whole ensemble better. This brings us to the subject of legato, the most difficult articulation of all for pizzicato players. And I want to bring up a quote from my teacher who I mentioned earlier, Doris Keyes. She said, and remember we were studying piano, she said legato is the most important articulation of all because it's much easier to break a line than to put it together in the first place. Take a second and think about that. It's much easier to break a line than to put it together in the first place. If you can play something legato, she argued, you can always play it staccato, you can always play it semi-legato. Most people have the most trouble really connecting a line. And I find this true for pizzicato players because if you think about it, what we do when we pluck a string, the mechanics of what happens are that when the finger goes to strike the second note, it's momentarily stopping the first note as that finger comes through the string again. So legato is a precious thing for us because it's almost physically impossible to do given the mechanism that we're using to produce the sound. So now we're going to examine legato techniques in the pizzicato style. And I would almost call these micro legato techniques, the first 4 of them, things that can help us get more legato into our playing. There's 4 techniques and then 1 general technique. The first is the hammer-on, which is a left-hand technique only. And we're going to examine these in depth, one by one, right after we list them. Pull-off, which is a left-hand only technique. The rake, which is a 2-hand technique. The slide, or vomit, or glissando, which is a left-hand only technique. And finally, articulated legato, which is a 2-hand technique. And we're going to get to this last because it's the most complicated and elusive of all of these techniques. Hammer-on technique. We'll go through it really quick. The name is explanatory, right? So if you are doing a hammer-on, you're playing one note, and you're hammering on a note above it, a half step or whole step above it. It's an ascending technique only to an adjacent stepwise note on the same string. There are exceptions to this, but that's the general gist of it. This is really important. It's better executed with force from a larger muscle group than with local finger control. So what that means on the bass is it's not a technique where you're moving one finger, although it can be. I see it done this way a lot. But it's better done with larger muscle groups, meaning rather than moving the finger, it's better to move the whole hand. And the difference between these things is really important, so I'm going to spend a minute to go into it. If you want to practice doing it just with the finger, what you need to do is cut off the rest of this arm from that finger, which would mean fixing your elbow to your side. So now the only thing that can move is the muscles in the forearm can move that finger. There's no wrist involved, no elbow, no shoulder, and you have this sound when you do that. If you take the whole arm and fix the hand, and move the finger by moving the arm, it's a much stronger hammer motion and a much stronger stop and a much stronger sound. Think for a moment if you've ever seen a master carpenter drive in a nail. If you see someone who doesn't know how to use a hammer, I don't know if I do have a pencil here. If you see someone who doesn't know how to use a hammer trying to drive a nail, think of the first time you ever drove in a nail, especially as a child, right? What do people do? They choke up on the hammer so that only the head of the hammer is sticking out, and then they hold the nail, and they're really careful. They're really scared of smashing their fingers, so they go tap, 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 tap. And what usually happens is the nail doesn't go in or barely goes in, and often it bends because it's using this really inefficient motion. You watch a master carpenter, someone who's been doing it for years and years, they take the hammer near the end of the handle, they put the nail down here, they raise the hammer, and they let the weight of the hammer drive the nail in. So And it goes in usually in 1 or 2 strikes, and the nail almost never bends because they're applying force in a logical way. Same thing here, not this, but this. Using all of this. Very efficient. Okay, and here's very important. A hammer-on may be executed from a strong beat to a weaker beat, or vice versa. And the distinction between strong to weak hammer-ons and weak to strong hammer-ons may seem more subjectively suited to a particular style. Let's dive into that point for a moment, because that's really important. Here's an example of hammer-ons from the suites. Here's the first 4 measures of the Allemande from the first suite. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to indiscriminately apply the hammer-on technique to this example. And if you can see, I'm just looking for the first place there's an ascending scalar line, and I'm going to start applying hammer-ons. And if I do that, I get this result. Now on the positive side, that does give us some little micro legato places in there where we're not plucking every note, and that's important. However, on the negative side, in measure 1 and in measure 3, these hammer-ons that go from a weak beat to a strong beat introduce an element of syncopation into the line that isn't really stylistically appropriate, because the truth is, when you do a hammer-on, the first note is always going to be more accented than the second one, and it doesn't really make so much sense to be going in Bach, because it's not that kind of syncopated kind of music. So when you discover something like that, you've tried a technique and it doesn't quite work, and you may be wondering why, you can think, let's flip the script on that. If the hammer-ons going from weak to strong did not sound appropriate, let me try and reorganize them to where they now appear from strong to weak. So in this example, you'll see that the hammer-on started just half a beat later, but it now lines the hammers up to where they go strong to weak instead. And then the example sounds like this. And I think you'll agree that sounds probably a bit more appropriate for Bach. It's not to say that you can't ever use a weak to strong hammer array, but the strong to weak is the better sort of default choice. So this instead of this. Okay, moving on to a jazz example. So in jazz, here's an example of a jazz melody. And here, if we do the same thing, and we play the beginning of Ornithology with this strong to weak hammer array built into it, we're going to get this sound, which is kind of like this. And again, it does give us some legato built into the line, and it actually works, but it sounds a bit too march-like. Right? And just in the opposite of the Bach example, it sounds too straight and a little bit too stiff. So like with the Bach example, what we can do next is flip the script. And so now instead of strong weak, we say, okay, I tried that, it sounds a little stodgy. Now I'm going to switch it and see if weak to strong may sound a little bit more appropriate, because I do want to use the hammers. If I go weak to strong, they sound a little bit more like this. obviously is much more like a jazz phrasing. Listen to the difference one more time. Versus, right? And it's pretty obvious that that second one is more appropriate for a jazz setting because it actually accentuates the syncopation that is implied in a bebop line. So when you discover these examples and the distinction between strong weak and weak strong in a particular piece of literature or repertoire, it makes sense, and you find them to be useful, it makes sense to practice them sort of in isolation. Here I'm just going to make up an example, a 2-octave scale, where I break up the scale into 2-note groups, and I'm going to play it once with a strong weak hammer-on pattern. Right? And that can be, you know, made into, that's an 8th note example, it could be a 16th note example. Be made into a triplet example, etc. The possibilities for creating an exercise are almost limitless. The point is, if you know that technique will be useful, it's good to work it into your exercise practice so that when it occurs in the literature, it will feel natural to your body. Here's an example of weak to strong, right? So the same 2-octave scale, but now we're going to switch where the hammers occur. Right? So now it has more of a jazz phrasing to it. So there's the concepts of hammer-on, strong to weak, and weak to strong. This brings us to the next technique on the list, the pull-off. The pull-off is very similar to a hammer-on in reverse, so we'll go through this much more quickly than we did with hammer-ons because most of the points still apply. The name is not self-explanatory. It's not really pulling your finger off the string. It's more like plucking sideways on the string. But as soon as you say the words pluck off, you realize why we don't call it that. Instead, we just call it a pull-off. Abbreviated on all the scores as just P over a slur. It's a descending technique only to an adjacent stepwise note on the same string. It can, of course, be greater than stepwise, but most of the time it's a stepwise technique. Like the hammer-on, it's better executed with force from the larger muscle groups than with local finger control. Big difference between and. So you want to use the entire arm mechanism and shoulder. Like the hammer-on, may be executed from strong to weak or weak to strong. And like the hammer-on, the distinction between strong-weak and weak-strong may be important depending on the style of music that you're playing. In the realm of Bach, the perfect example to demonstrate pull-off is the prelude from the first suite. So here's the first 4 bars of the prelude from the first suite. The melodic line of the first section of this piece is basically built around the idea of these 2 upper notes rocking back and forth. So we use a pull-off for that. In the realm of jazz, here's where the strong-weak, weak-strong distinction makes a big difference. So we start with the first 4 bars of Donna Lee, and if we play that with pull-offs from strong beat to weak beat, it sounds a little bit like this. Now, technically that kind of works. Because you do get some legato in the line. However, it sounds really super stiff. Da-ba-da-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba. As we did with hammer-ons, we should probably take a look at how it would sound if we were playing it weak to strong. And you notice when you play it weak to strong, it's got a lot more of that syncopated legato flavor as opposed to the strong weak version. So, like with hammer-ons, maybe weak to strong for a jazz setting should be the default. Although, as we'll see later, once you get into playing extended excerpts or extended pieces of real music, you do end up mixing both of these things together, but only because they sound good and because they work ergonomically on the bass. Like with the hammer-ons, if you discover that a technique is useful, it may be useful to you to make an exercise out of it. So this exercise shown here is just the exact opposite of the hammer-on exercise. 2-octave scale descending using pull-offs. And like with the hammer-on example, you could turn that into triplets or 16th notes. Or make up your own exercises. The point is to get it under your hand, apart from music, so that when you take it into the music, it's not a completely new thing. And of course, because strong to weak and weak to strong is an important distinction, it makes sense to devise an exercise not only strong to weak, but also weak to strong. And all the permutations of that. So that's the pull-off technique and the distinction between strong-weak and weak-strong. And this brings us to the next technique on our list, the rake. Rake is a little bit different from the others. Its name is pretty descriptive. It refers to using the same right-hand finger to pluck consecutive notes over a descending string crossing. It's the sound that you get when you go, because you're not actually making a new motion with your right hand to pluck the next note, because your finger's already on the string. Both hands are involved in a legato rake, and it's kind of hard to explain. It's easier to demonstrate than to explain, but I'm going to put up on the screen probably the most convoluted explanation of what a rake is, a legato rake is, but then it's much easier to demonstrate. So the definition is the right hand plucks the string it's resting on after striking the next higher string immediately before. We get that, right? While the left hand allows the higher note to ring just long enough to connect it to the lower note before muting the higher note to avoid an unintentional double stop. And this is really important because there's a difference between this, where everything is ringing, and this. Notice that second time I did that, once those two notes were connected, the left hand came in and muted the higher note. So it just sounded like a connection rather than a chord. And the same thing is going to come in when we start looking at the musical examples. We'll go back to that first beginning of the Suite 1 prelude. There's a lot of rakes built into this, and a lot of rakes built into music in general because there's a lot of descending string crossings. Even in that first bar, beat 2 is made of rakes, beats 2 and beats 4 actually, because those beats are identical. But there's a big difference between playing them as double stops and playing them as rakes. That's a double stop. And that's not really what we want in this example. What we want So it's really important that we understand that it is a two-hand technique and that the left hand is really important. It's not just right hand. So here's this example with the rakes built in. This last bit, from the open string to the fingered second string, is very much something that Bach would have written for the cello in the cello suites. It's just that they're tuned in fifths and we're tuned in fourths. So sometimes we can't do the string crossings that he originally intended as cellists can, but we sometimes find passages in the music where we can do something similar. So that's how this edition turned out. For Rake examples in the jazz repertoire, think of measures 7 through 11 of Ornithology. And in this passage, the Rake helps us get this legato on all the descending string crossings. And in this last measure of this example, there's a double Rake. And again, we don't want, right, which is really muddy. That sound of legato without the restriking of the string, but also muting of the upper string. Right? So rakes are really common in music. In fact, most jazz players that I know, basically they automatically build these into any descending string crossing that they play. It's just automatically built into their technique anytime they want a legato articulation. So in these editions of the suites, they're written in, and every time you play one, it's written in. In real life, it may just become a sort of technical habit that you connect the notes that way rather than breaking them automatically. But for the suites, it's good to write them in so you're actually doing things consciously. In real music, it's most common for techniques to be combined, meaning that in any passage of music, there's going to be, that is, any passage of music anyway that is legato, you're going to have combinations of hammer-ons, pull-offs, rakes, and as we'll see in the next section, sometimes even slides. This example shows 3 techniques combined. This is from the beginning of Minuet 2 from Suite 1. It includes pull-offs, rakes, and hammer-ons. And notice that some of the techniques go from strong to weak, and some of them go from weak to strong. In the context of a greater piece of music or a greater excerpt of music, it doesn't really matter that much as long as it sounds good, because we've said before, well, maybe in Bach they should be strong to weak, and maybe in jazz they should be weak to strong. Again, in music, you orient the micro legato techniques in a way that makes the music speak. So here's the beginning of Minuet 2 using combination of hammer-ons, pull-offs, and rakes. So you see how all of those things combine to give a very legato sound. Most passages of music are like that. You'll learn to automatically sort of combine these things, and it's only when they don't seem to stylistically fit that you may want to go back and rearrange them, as we've discussed earlier. This brings us to our 4th technique on the list, the slide or vomit technique, also known as a glissando. The name is perfectly descriptive. The parenthetical name, the vomit, is also perfectly descriptive if it's played slowly or badly. That's why it's called that. It's an ascending or descending technique, sliding from one note to another on the same string using the same finger. Like the hammer-on and the pull-off, the first note of a 2-note slide is always more accented than the second. It's just the nature of the beast. When we play pizzicato, the string that we strike is going to be louder than the one that we use some technique to get to. As your technique increases, the interval that you can effectively use a slide increases. So we start, and they're usually whole steps or half steps. But as you get more experience with it, you can play wider and wider intervals. And here's a really important part about the slide or the vomit. It promotes a deep connection to the fingerboard, which is really healthy for left-hand technique. I think back about 20 years, I had a lesson with Rufus Reed, and it was like almost a 3-hour lesson, which was amazing. And we spent the first hour doing nothing but slide and vomit exercises. So he would have me play a melody using only one finger on one string. And so he would say, you know, okay, great. Then he would say, okay, play that same melody, My Romance in this case, with your middle finger. Then with your third finger, and I would do that. And then with your fourth finger, and I would do that. And I would think, okay, finally we get to move on from this. And he would say, now we move on to the second string, and so on. And so we did it for a long time. And the reason I remember that is because his concept, Rufus's concept of his melodic concept is incredibly lyrical, and it's mainly or partially because he has a very, very deep connection with his left hand into the board. It's very important to him to stay connected to the board at all time with this weight of the arm, and I think that's a really great thing to advocate for. Obviously it worked for him throughout his career, and every time I focus on that, I notice that my lines get a little bit more lyrical. So deep connection to the fingerboard with the left hand is really incredibly important. I don't tend to use slides that much in the music of Bach. It may be that I just haven't found the right place where they fit, or it may be that when I play one, they sound unstylistic, or it may be that my technique is just not advanced enough to make them work. Perhaps 10 years into the future, I'll be able to make them work. But here's an example from the jazz repertoire, probably one of the nastiest melodic passages in terms of technically difficult to play, the Bridge of Confirmation. This passage is such that even saxophone players and trumpet players sort of grimace when this is coming up because it's so difficult. It's really the second half of it that we want to focus on. But the second half of it uses two slides to connect that passage together in a way that would be really, really difficult to do any other way. And it's that second part. So that part's easy enough. It's a hammer-on. Slide up to the A flat, slide down to the D, pull off, and the slides I find in bebop playing, they become very useful to connect notes that would be really physically difficult to do any other way. Something that doesn't fit, a hammer-on, something that doesn't fit, a pull-off or a rake, but doesn't want to be re-articulated, as this particular passage, right? It wants to just be one big melodic slur. So that technique really works well for that. And I think you'll find that the more you look for places where they work, or where they might be used, with enough practice they can be made to work, and they become this sort of sleight of hand or sleight of ear. So that's the slide or the vomit technique. Well, this brings us to the last of our legato techniques, the articulated legato, what Doris Keyes used to call the holy grail of legato. The term is not technically accurate, since restriking the string adds a break in the line or an attack in the line. So articulated legato is sort of a misnomer, but it's actually a form of sleight of hand or ear in which a longer line appears to be connected by the performer's articulation pattern, and as we'll see later, by the performer's intent to have the listener hear a connected line. It allows longer phrases to be connected using one long aural slur or phrase slur, involves a wide variety of soft articulation techniques involving both hands. This is incredibly important. It begins with the intent of the performer to connect a given set of notes into a unified musical phrase. we're going to dive into some of this stuff in a moment. In the left hand, articulated legato means the left hand should remain into the board whenever possible, especially during shifts. The only exception is when an open string is played, so the left hand stays connected deep into the board, except when crossing through an open string. If you think of jazz students, think of a jazz student whose line, maybe a walking bass line, sounds and notice when they shift there's a break in the line, so that left hand has to stay connected. By the left hand staying into the board. That's something that I have to correct with students a lot, and to make them hear those little breaths that they make when they shift. Weight transfer from one note to the next is really important. Each step should connect to the arm and shoulder. Again, not but. So that everything stays weight into the board. One way to think of the above point is to think of every note as being a potential candidate for vibrato. Everything except an open string, of course. And this really changes the way that we approach our left hand. Because when you play as though every note might have vibrato, you're actually putting the full weight of your arm and the full focus of your arm on that note, rather than holding a position where part of the weight is on a lower finger and part of the weight is on a higher finger. The technical goal is to minimize or eliminate all possible audible space or breaths between the left hand stops. Right hand aspects of articulated legato. The depth of the right hand stroke is paramount. Right? There's a range from the deepest possible rest stroke, which is fingerboard to fingerboard, to the lightest possible rest stroke, which is lightly grazing the string. This range is needed. So if I'm playing a deep stroke, hitting the fingerboard before and after each stroke, very deep, completely under the string, then I'm going to get a really sharp articulation. If I'm grazing the string, likewise, if I just barely graze the string, it's a very softer articulation still. And there's an infinite grading scale of those hard and soft articulations, but we're going to simplify that in a moment. For this reason, the angle of the stroke is critically important. So for me, everything is controlled by the elbow and shoulder, so if I want a really articulate deep stroke, elbow is going to be high and the shoulder is going to be turned in. And that puts down pressure on the finger playing. Right? Whereas if I want a softer stroke, I'll drop the elbow a little bit, which will make the finger not be pressing into the board. That's also quieter, as well as not quite as sharp in articulation. The velocity of the stroke when restriking the string is incredibly important, so that no momentary stopping of the string is audible. One other thing I hear with students a lot when playing walking lines is this sound. Because the string is, the finger is not coming through the string fast enough. It's actually stopping the string in between notes. But if you have enough velocity on the right hand finger, you don't hear that micro moment where the finger actually stops the string as it's already vibrating and then sets it in motion again. As opposed to velocity. Again, that's sort of a sleight of ear because the string actually does kind of stop, but if you do it fast enough, the listener won't hear it. And here's the part that's really important. It can be helpful to imagine the articulation parallels in wind instrument tone production and articulation when developing this concept. That sounds more complicated than it is. If you imagine a line played by a wind instrument will articulate something in a hard and very pointed way by saying with the tongue, ta 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 ta. If they want a softer articulation, they'll use instead of a T, they'll use a D, a D, a da 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 da. So ta 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 ta, deep stroke, like the T on the roof of the mouth. Softer stroke, shallower stroke, da 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 da. And when they want to group a lot of notes together, they'll go softer still and use something like dugga 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 dugga. So that only the first of those group of four really sounds as though it's articulated, and then the rest are sort of flowing from that first. If I get a chance, I'm going to insert an example of Mrs. Keyes' explanation of articulated legato on the piano. If I'm able to do that here in my music room, I'll insert that into the video. Doris Keyes was responsible for my lifelong fascination with the idea of articulated legato because it came on an instrument which is even less legato than the bass, than pizzicato bass, which is the piano. Piano is nothing if not a series of mechanical hammers striking strings. So the idea that this instrument could produce legato just didn't really compute to me, especially without the pedal. Obviously with the pedal you can make the notes run together, but so she would have me prepare a piece, and I would come in the next week and she would say, okay, play the piece you've been working on, play the Bach excerpt you've been working on. And I would sit down and I would play something like, and she would ask me questions like, okay, what instrument are you imagining playing that? And I was 20, you know, so I was like, well, the piano. And she would say, well, duh, but why? Why the piano? And I said, well, because it's a piano piece. And she would say, okay, but have you considered what this might sound like if it were played by wind instruments? For instance, if it were 3 woodwind instruments, play it as though it were 3 woodwind instruments, and I would have no idea how to begin. And then she would go down to take a seat at the piano and she would demonstrate. And I have to warn you, I can't do her demonstrations even a tiny bit of justice, but I'll do my best, because she would play something, say, okay, imagine 3 woodwinds playing this legato. And she would play something like, justice, but you get the idea. And so I would have 2 reactions to this. The first one is that my head exploded because I never thought of this before, that you could be thinking of strings or woodwinds while you're playing, and just by the fact of you thinking that, you could make the listener start to hear a different sound than the instrument that you're actually playing. And the second thing that planted a seed in my mind at that time, based on her demonstrations at various times, was the idea that when we perform, we are performing not just music on our instrument, we are performing sort of a magic trick, if you will. She always used the phrase sleight of ear, meaning I'm playing a piano, but I want to make you hear a string section. I'm playing a piano, but I want to make you hear winds. I want to make you hear a French horn. And so I think this has applications for us as bassists or players of any instrument, because how we conceive of the music is going to have a huge effect on how the listener hears what we're giving them when we play our instrument. And we have a lot more options than we probably think we do at first. And now back to our regularly scheduled program. Treating bebop melodies with the same attention to detail as cello suite movements. And this is really the point of this whole presentation for jazz teachers and for jazz students. So many times in jazz, students tend to look at melodies as something to get through and get past so that they can get on to the improvisation portion of the song and playing their walking bass lines and playing their scales and their licks and their patterns over the changes of the song. And I think this really does a disservice to the music. It also doesn't help that in most jazz lead sheets, they're written as a sort of shorthand just to get people playing. So when you look at a jazz version of a melody, it looks very much like a naked score, and there's no articulations written in. Often there are no dynamics. So here's the beginning of Ornithology, and a student who has not had much classical training or is not trained to think of melodies in a potentially lyrical way, especially one who hasn't heard the original recordings, might look at this and they would just try to machine gun out the notes and the rhythms. Right? And to them it's like, oh, if you can play it fast and loud, that's really good. But we know, as we go back and listen to great jazz players play, that the greatest players are those who can really make a melody sing, who can really articulate a melody and really make it speak in a lyrical way. We know that no horn player in their right mind would articulate every note of this melody the way that I just did on the bass, the way that many students tend to when they approach a melody for the first time. No horn player would ever go ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. It would never happen. Right? A horn player is always going to use a combination of hard and soft articulations. So there's very little ta in there and a lot of gradients of soft articulations. That brings us to the next slide and the next thing to work with students as you encourage them to treat jazz melodies and bebop melodies with the same care as they would if they were classical pieces of music. So now we consider the phrase connection implications. These are what I call quasi-phrase legato markings, so it's showing where notes are connected and to sort of consider the whole thing as a phrase that has a shape. In bars 3 and 4, you'll notice that what is actually the whole phrase is not necessarily treated as the whole phrase because there are rests in the middle of it. But still, it's much closer to the truth than that first naked score. A student who's thinking of it this way, instead of machine gunning their way through it, might be more likely to use some soft articulations. So that even if they are articulating every note, they're articulating them in a very musical way. Not everything even, not everything the same dynamic, not everything with the same importance, but articulating them with the overall phrase in mind. And that is a huge step towards getting a more lyrical, melodic concept for jazz players. The third step is to see the entire phrase structure and to add the details, the technical details that you might use to bring that phrase out, right? So in this example, we've added actual phrase markings over the phrases of the music. We've included the micro legato techniques that could be involved in making this phrase work, making this piece of music work. Hammer-ons, pull-offs, rakes to give us a little bit more flow in the line so we don't have to actually, even if we're not going ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, we don't always have to go da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da either. We can still have, now we can have ba-boo-ba-dee-boo-bee-a-bop, right? Because we have some of these places where there's actual legato built in, right? And there's a big difference between and right? Those two things are actually miles apart. And this last one is what I'm always trying to encourage students to do, to take this take this jazz melody, this bebop melody, and treat it as though you were playing a piece by Beethoven or Mozart or Bach, to bring it back home to our presentation. Treat it with the same care and respect as you would those melodies, as you would if you were preparing a piece of that music for an applied teacher in that area. And all of a sudden, when you start to do that, the whole world opens up. If a student were to do that with the entire melody of confirmation, it might sound something like the following example. We finally come to the end of our presentation. I apologize for the length of it, but as promised, as a coda to this production, I want to talk a bit about the ways in which Bach's melodic and harmonic language are unbelievably similar to the language of bebop. In the past 5 years, I have been asked to create and have created a jazz analysis class at the University of Louisville. It is actually turned into a comparative analysis class. So what the class does is compares the music of the Western tradition with the music of jazz. And it's a class primarily for jazz students, and the point of it is to show that our music is really not that different from most other Western music. Students are asked to do things like analyze pieces of music by Bach, Mozart, Purcell, other Western composers for melodic and harmonic content. And here's a couple of examples from that class to show some of the things that it covers and that they discover as they dive into this material. What we see here is Bach's Invention number 4 in D minor, and students are asked to analyze it with chord symbols over the top, and at the same time they're analyzing bebop heads with Roman numerals under the bottom, just to show that those two forms of analysis are also two facets of the same thing. When they do that, you see that this progression looks very much like a standard lead sheet. You see, 1, 5, 1, 5, 1, and then you see sequences of chords just as you would in a jazz progression. I'm going to move on, and here's an example from Invention 13 in A minor. Again, analyzed with a lead sheet, in lead sheet format with chord symbols. And we go to page 2, and you see the sort of sequences that occur here. There's actually the actual sequence from Fly Me to the Moon is in the second system on this page, which is pretty amazing. It's unbelievably jazz-like. There are flat 9 chords, just standard types of progressions that you find in jazz. So the harmonic language itself is very similar, but it's the melodic language which is so much like bebop. In analyzing both Bach and bebop, I asked the students to make a tally of how often a composer lands on what part of a chord on the downbeat of that chord change. So once the Bach is analyzed, they can then analyze the piece for melodic content, saying, okay, on the downbeat of this chord change, Bach lands on the root, or the third, or the fifth, etc. And for the D minor example, which is the one that we're going to use for our comparison here at the very end of this video, they found that over the course of the entire D minor invention of the upper voice, Bach landed on the root, on the downbeat of a chord change, 22% of the time, and the fifth, 22% of the time. By far the most common landing point for the melody on the downbeat was the third, 40% of the time. And then there were a couple of outliers. He lands on the 7th, 14% of the time, and then a couple of outliers, 9th and the 11th, which almost never happens. So then, once they've done this downbeat analysis and percentage tally, this percent of the time he lands on this percent of the time he lands on this, they are asked to do the same for bebop melodies and solos. Here's one from Charlie Parker from the Melody of Confirmation. Here you can see the tallies are nearly identical, and the percent of time that Charlie Parker lands on the root or the fifth is almost identical to what Bach did in the D minor invention. By far the most common landing point for the melody is the third, and then there's a couple of outliers. The only real difference is that Charlie Parker lands on the ninth and the seventh with equal frequency, whereas Bach landed on the seventh with 14%, and between the seventh and the ninth, Charlie Parker lands on them combined 14%. When you put the two side by side, it's almost eerie how identical the melodic and harmonic language of the two melodic languages are. It's almost as though they're speaking the same language through different dialects or different styles. And it's not just these two pieces. In the class we analyze a much greater number of pieces, and we come to a lot of the same conclusions, which is that these two styles of music, not only are they similar, they are harmonically and melodically almost identical. They are just separated by several hundred years and a rhythmic style and a musical style, but in terms of the language themselves, the language itself, the two musics are almost identical in many ways. This becomes important for jazz players because when you practice Bach as a jazz player, when you practice Bach, which is what this whole video has been about and this whole presentation has been about, when you practice Bach, you're not only practicing something which will technically make you a better bassist, something which will teach you how to better articulate lyrically on your instrument, something that'll teach you a lot of techniques that you can transfer over to jazz. But you're also basically practicing the melodic language of jazz. You're practicing outlining harmonies by landing on chord tones on downbeats. And by getting that sound in your ear, you're sort of completing the cycle, so that by the time you have that sound in your ear and it comes time to improvise, hopefully you will be improvising along the same lines as the melodies you have been studying in both styles. So that's it for the presentation. Sorry we couldn't have more on this last part, but I think the presentation has been long enough, and I will give an attempt to play us out with an example that I hope will show the way that the similarity in styles and the similarity in articulation moving from Bach to bebop shows up not only in the melodic construction and the melodic versions of melodies that players might choose to put together in both styles, but also in the improvisation that every jazz player usually will end up doing right after the melody. So I'll give it my best shot and to play us a little walking music. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you next time.